Thank you. So thank you to Cheryl for setting up the webinar and for advertising it. Thank you to all that are joining us today. Also like to thank Dr. Shi, Washington State University, and the National Center for Transportation, Infrastructure, Durability, and Life Extension, as well as the UTC program in general for the opportunity to do this work. So like Cheryl said, my name is Wes Marshall. I'm a professor at University of Colorado, Denver. Nick Coppola is a recent PhD graduate. This was his dissertation work. So I'm going to give about a 10 or 15 minute introduction to the work, to a lot of the stuff we're doing. And Nick's going to get into some of the nitty gritty of what he did as well. And Nick now works at the Colorado Department of Transportation. All right, so let me get started. If you ask, I think, most transportation engineers to talk about our current situation, they're probably going to start with something like this. You'll see these ASCE report cards for a crumbling infrastructure, bridges, the broke and the failing transit system. This rail grade, I think, was a little bit surprising to me because I know in some parts of the country, we're still actually using rail infrastructure that was put in place when Abraham Lincoln was president. But regardless, engineers, we like to put these numbers in perspective and say, well, if we don't invest $157 billion now, that we're going to have to spend whatever $1 trillion later. Related to the infrastructure crises that we're having, you see places that are choked by traffic congestion. In fact, traffic congestion is inevitably always listed as one of our key national transportation priorities. And the same thing, if we don't spend billions of dollars trying to fix traffic congestion, it's going to cost us $1 trillion down the line. We also have, air quality, which is clearly a transportation-related human health issue. We also can't forget that road safety is the same thing. After all, dying on the roads is definitely not good for your health. And despite the fact that most of us stayed home for a lot of 2020, we still somehow killed more than 100 people a day last year. And this is a problem, not just the United States, but around the world. All right, so how are we going to fix all this? Technology always seems to be sort of the magic elixir. And I feel like when talking about the future of transportation, we always hear about things like AVs and hyperloops and how they're going to fix everything. And when I say everything, it really is almost everything. You see images like this one from Business Insider talking about air quality and better sidewalks and no more street signs and no more deaths and no more traffic and no more need for parking spaces. And to the point where I even found this kid's book that brags about how these autonomous cars are apparently going to water our plants and change our light bulbs for us. But to me, it's hard to get excited about spending trillions of dollars in that sort of technology when we can't even get the sidewalks right. Here's an example of a 2-foot sidewalk with a rolled curb on a major street in Denver. And this is the kind of thing you can't even fit 2 people next to each other on a sidewalk like this. And those were great sidewalks compared to many of those that are missing. And examples like this are embarrassing, I think, to see in a major US city near the downtown, as is something like this or this. And we can't even oftentimes be bothered to put a sidewalk right next to a bus stop. And this is a bus stop in Denver that 22,000 people per day use. And this one leads right to a light rail station that we invested billions of dollars into. But that is a lot better than a lot of places. And I think for traffic engineers, sometimes we forget that, real people use these places. I took this picture less than a mile from the heart of downtown Denver. And when we don't provide this sort of fundamental infrastructure, we force real people into real dangerous situations. Here's a wheelchair user that can't fit into the sidewalk, so they're in the road. And I see this time and time again. I feel like every time I come to work, I could take another picture or something like this. All right, but even if a city really wants to fix this problem, where can they start? In another recent project, one of my master's students, Peter Gibson, interviewed 16 cities about the data they collect for roadways and how they use that data. Basically, every city collected amazing road data on a very regular basis and analyzed that data in these great software packages. If there's a pothole, they would have these service agreements that are going to be out there in 2 days or less, or something like that. We then asked the exact same questions for sidewalks, and almost every time we heard, well, it's complicated. And what we found is that most cities would have no idea where to start when they're trying to fix sidewalks because there's a systematic lack of data. And it's not that they couldn't do it, because soon after I moved to Denver in 2009, I found this sidewalk polygon data on Denver's open data website. It was data from 2004, and every other data set that they were regularly updating, but this one wasn't. When I asked somebody why, I was told that the city's lawyers told them that they couldn't update it because if they knew there was a problem, they'd be liable. So, like an ostrich, we sort of stuck our heads down the proverbial manhole. But that didn't work. I mean, cities get sued over these issues all the time. And cities are only now beginning to realize that pretending not to know where there's a problem doesn't protect you from liability. At the same time, a lot of regions have started to collect what is called planometric data. And it's based on high resolution imagery. And it's a little funny to see that some of the cities collecting this data are not even doing it for the reasons to do with ADA or sidewalks or anything like that. A lot of them are doing it just to count the amount of impervious areas so they can bill residents. And this is actually the bill I got in the mail last week, where basically I'm charged for the amount of impervious area that I have in my property. But this data can also be used to quantify sidewalks. So I guess regardless of the underlying intent, this is a huge opportunity. And I think lucky for me, lucky for us, I had the perfect PhD student willing to take on this challenge. And Nick had just graduated with a GIS master's degree, and he was starting up a transportation engineering degree. So I think you'll hear when Nick starts presenting his work that skill set was invaluable to doing this. And Nick will tell you a little bit more about this, but one of the initially shocking things to find was just how little research there was out there on sort of sidewalks and stuff like that. And the research that is out there, much of it would look at a single neighborhood, or they would collect the sidewalk data from inside of a moving car with a clipboard. It was pretty wild to see some of what the researchers were doing. So it was an enjoyable lit review, unlike this card suggests. But as we started getting into this work too, we all started to notice that the basic sidewalk data that we can get from the planometric data, where we can measure things like sidewalk availability and width, is not enough, because traffic engineers sometimes like to place obstacles in our sidewalks. The sort of thing that we would never ever see placed in a roadway, we often have no problem shoving onto a sidewalk. And we often leave people with an obstacle course. So trying to figure out the importance of accounting for these things that we call static obstructions in our sidewalk data is the first half of what Nick's going to present looks at, because it's important. I mean, here's a picture I took while biking to work just recently of a wheelchair user, forced off what should be a perfectly usable sidewalk, but due to all the sort of static obstructions, they're forced into the street. I think luckily in this case, she had a protected bike lane to use, but in most situations, there aren't any other options. And if we turn our sidewalks into parkour courses, like we saw on the previous slides, we might as well close them for business. So we can do better, but it's complicated because we often will place a decent sidewalk along a terrible arterial. And despite the fact that this example borders a public school, we can't even be bothered to drop the speed limit during school zone times, even in a location where students have lost their lives as pedestrians. And this is one of those locations. So to me, this is more than just an asset management issue. In the second half of the presentation, Nick will show you the data-driven methodology we came up with and developed to help cities prioritize their sidewalk infrastructure. Even though I'm showing you, at least in this brief presentation, a lot of pictures of Denver, these methods that we came up with could work anywhere, which is good because I can't really think of any cities that don't need help on this issue. So big picture, I think we need to fix this because I have a hard time hearing people pine over autonomous cars and hyperloops when we're still failing at our most basic and fundamental infrastructure, which is sidewalks. All right, so now let's hear from Nick Coppola. He's a recent PhD graduate of ours, like I said. He teaches our GIS and transportation graduate course now, and also works at the Department of Transportation at CDOT in Colorado. So Nick, I think you can share your screen.
Sounds good. Thanks, Dr. Marshall. Okay, perfect. So thank you for having me here today. As Dr. Marshall has already introduced, the research that I've been fortunate to work with him on with this project from grant funding with the National Center for Transportation Infrastructure, Durability, and Life Extension. So first and foremost, I always like to make sure that I say thank you for all of the support. I feel very fortunate. And with that, let's get started here. So everybody is a pedestrian at some point during their day. Walking is something that is fundamental. We'll walk, whether we're going to go meet somebody for a coffee, if we're going to go out to eat, we're going to and from work, or even if we're just walking for leisure, just walking about. Unfortunately, this is all too common of what we will see. We'll see sidewalks that are missing, sidewalks that just dead end or go nowhere, or we'll see narrow sidewalks or inconsistent sidewalks, poor quality. And this makes pedestrians feel like an afterthought. And to be honest, the federal government has even acknowledged this directly. They've even stated that walking is a forgotten mode of transportation, as you can see in this study here. Unfortunately, what we're starting to see is there are cities across the United States that are starting to attend to this. They're starting to come up with pedestrian plans, and we're seeing that, like I said, from coast to coast, which is great. The unfortunate thing is this still isn't enough. We're still seeing that cities are having a difficult time understanding how to tackle this backlog of issues. And there's also a lack of funding that goes along with this. So a very good example that I found was the Milwaukee Pedestrian Plan. They state this very directly. So if you check within their plan, they state, number one, that there is a lack of funding for pedestrian infrastructure. And number two, they talk directly about a lack of data, essentially about pedestrian infrastructure. So even beyond looking at pedestrian plans, if you look at the academic literature, you're going to see this come up time and again, where it's noted that there is a lack of data. You're going to see them talking about the scarcity of geospatial data that is available. But it's more than just the data. We're also seeing that there's a lack of literature on this. And even when literature does exist, we're finding that the research that is being done on a very small scale. So maybe a couple streets, or they'll be using roadways or data that's not sidewalks or not pedestrian infrastructure. So in comes spatial data. This is where we're able to make use of advances in geospatial data, as well as making use of advances in things like big data, so that we can start to find a way to research this, fill that gap. This is a considerable gap that we're finding, not just in the planning, but also the academic literature. So the first thing that we had to do was to learn more about sidewalks and understand about the sidewalk data. So as Dr. Marshall had already prefaced and mentioned, we took a look at what's called planometric data. So as an example that you can see in this image here, planometric data will take aerial imagery. And from that imagery, you can see that they're basically tracing, it's a two-dimensional representation of the infrastructure on the ground. So one example will be, you can see the yellow lines here are depicting where your buildings would be. And they'll do the same thing for sidewalk data, which is what we ended up using. Now, the reason for this, the benefit to this, is that it's even been documented in academic literature stating that you need GIS and you need this data if you want to be able to quantify and analyze something such as sidewalks at a large scale. So if we want to be able to do this at a city scale, we need to be able to make use of GIS and this type of data. So what we're getting at in the beginning is looking at how we can expand that geographic scale. So cities will often be looking initially at small sections like neighborhoods, as I had stated. So if you're looking at a whole city like Hartford, like in this example, the research will only show a study that is going to cover a really small portion of it. And if research wants to expand upon that and try to cover an entire city, they'll use the roadways. And as we know, a road doesn't necessarily mean that there's a sidewalk there. So we dug in. We went all the way in by checking every single US Census place with a population of 50,000 or more. So we checked 769 different cities throughout the United States for this data. What we found, the first thing that we found was that it wasn't that easy to find the data. This wasn't, wrapped up, in a beautiful package with a bow put on it. This took a lot of investigation. So we found that we had to check counties. We had to make sure we were checking the attributes to see what kind of data is being presented to us. We realized that it's not always called sidewalks. Sometimes it has a different name, such as paved area. And sometimes it's categorized not really quite as we were expecting it to be. So here you can see it's categorized under structure for City of Corvallis, and it's under impervious surface. So this took a little bit of detective work, to say the least, for that many cities. So to get started, we took 24 cities that had viable data so that we could see what we can do with this data and derive some information from the data. So what we're doing is we're taking what was once these small scale studies that we're seeing in the research, and now we're expanding it to look at the whole city. So to give an example of what we mean by that and how we actually approached it, this would be an example of what planometric data looks like. Now, every city, the data was slightly different. So take this as an example. So if this is the planometric data, what we would do is we would extract the sidewalks and the roadways from that data. Now, even from there, we still need to find a way to isolate that data. So what we did was we pulled parcels, which is what you see in the blue here, and we removed any sidewalks or roadways within those parcels so that it's isolated to the right of way. Now, the way that we initially approached this was we looked at sidewalk availability, and sidewalk availability, we're looking at it from the standpoint that for every road, there should be a sidewalk on both sides. So that's how we would calculate it. So for every mile of roadway, we should have 2 miles of sidewalk. That would equate to 100% availability. The next thing we looked at was sidewalk average width. So with sidewalk average width, we can take the polygons, we can measure the area of the polygon, the center line length of the polygon, and then just do the math. You do the area divided by the length, and that gives us the average width of that sidewalk polygon. So even after we measure the widths, we have to be able to compare it to something. So the comparison that we used were the sidewalk widths. Number one, that's presented by the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA. So this is sort of the standard. This is a standard. It's a law. The ADA is a law. And we used that 3-foot standard in addition to other proposed guidelines that you can see that are listed here. So we measured it against 3-foot, 4-foot, 5-foot, and 6-foot. So the last thing we looked at was a relative comparison of land coverage for the sidewalk and the roadway. So if we look at the area that is taken up by the sidewalk and the roadway in the right of way, we'll look at how much of that is the sidewalk, and then we'll look at how much of that area is the roadway. So here are some examples of the results that we found. We found, cities that have a high overall sidewalk width. As you can see, a good example is Peoria, Illinois, there on the left, versus cities that have a low overall sidewalk width, such as Cedar Rapids on the right. We could also take a look at the availability, as we had mentioned. So you can see Corvallis obviously is pretty well covered by their sidewalks versus Lynchburg, where you're only seeing it in what you can only assume is basically going to be the downtown section and the main streets. So overall, what we found is that there's a deficiency in sidewalk availability. When it comes to sidewalk availability, we found it's about 50%. So if you think about that number, 50%, and you put it into perspective of reality, that's basically saying on average, you only have a sidewalk on one side of the road, which is obviously not ideal, and it's not safe, as you can see in photos such as this. We still had just over 10% of these sidewalks that failed to meet that 3-foot width. So think about walking on sidewalks such as this. It's obviously not anything that looks like it would be fun to walk on, especially if, let's say, you're somebody who's walking with children, or even for somebody in a wheelchair. And then next we talked about the land coverage. So what we found was on average, there was 88% roadway and 12% sidewalk. And this is a pretty common sight that I feel like most people can nod their heads at and say, yeah, this looks pretty familiar. So now we've learned that we can derive information from sidewalk data. So the next step that we took was, let's take a look at this data and let's make it even better. Let's see what it looks like by including static obstructions. When we look at that planometric sidewalk data, it gives off the impression of sidewalks such as this, where everything is basically moved off of the sidewalk and you have these clear polygons, just to put it in a geospatial data standpoint. But the reality is that that's not what sidewalks look like. This is what we come across on a daily basis when you're walking through cities. There are obstructions that are in the way. So we used Cambridge, Massachusetts for this research. Cambridge had an exceptional data set available. And this is an image, a graphic that just shows what the planometric data would look like for part of the city of Cambridge. So let's zoom in and take a little bit closer look at what this data looks like. So if you were to download the planometric sidewalk polygon data, this is what it would look like. So it kind of gives almost a false representation of what sidewalks really look like in a city. Now include sidewalk obstructions. And you can tell just from these images, it's a very different situation that you would be coming across as a pedestrian on the sidewalk when you include those obstructions. So next, let's zoom in even closer and take an example of what this will look like. So when we're talking about static obstructions, we're talking about 18 different types of obstructions that we were able to find data for. So examples would be street trees or benches or lighting or garbage receptacles that you would find. And in total, there were over 30,000 of them that we found within the sidewalk polygons. So now that you have that in mind with an understanding of what we mean by an obstruction, let's take a look at what a close-up would look like on one of those sidewalks. So if we're not including the static obstruction, you can have a sidewalk that looks great. You can say, okay, we have 5-foot width here. That's plenty of room. You know, somebody in a wheelchair, stroller, whatever it may be, easy access. Now, if we include a static obstruction, all of a sudden that 5-foot width can very easily be cut down. And all of a sudden we went from 5 foot to 2 foot and it's impassable. So it's a completely different scenario. So how did we actually approach this analysis? So what we did was we took a look at every single sidewalk polygon in Cambridge, and we included those sidewalk obstructions, then we wanted to identify the maximum width around the obstruction and for the sidewalk itself. What this does is it gives us an idea of what's the optimal way for a pedestrian to navigate down this sidewalk. So at point A, you would have 2 feet to get around that first obstacle. At point B, it gives an idea of what the width of the sidewalk is. And at point C, the optimal way is obviously where you have 4 feet of space as opposed to 1 foot. Now that we have all that information, what we can do is we can identify what is the pinch point, because this is the important spot. This is where we want to know what is that minimum width along the sidewalk. And in this example, it would be 2 foot. So that's how we approached every single sidewalk polygon for all of Cambridge. So the results from the analysis will show that when we included sidewalks, it cut the number of compliant sidewalks nearly in half by adding those static obstructions into the data. So let's take a look at some examples of what that actually looks like at the 3, 4, 5, and 6 foot thresholds that we put in there. So at 3 foot, which as a reminder is the ADA, we went from, if you didn't have sidewalk static obstructions in place, it looks like 78% of those polygons are compliant at 3 foot. Once we included those static obstructions, it dropped to 51%. That's a 34% difference. As we move through, we go to 4 foot. Without obstructions, 59% are compliant. With obstructions, it drops to 31%. That's a 48% difference. At 5 foot, 36% are compliant without static obstructions. When we included the obstructions, it drops to 18%, which is just about 50%. It was 49%. At 6 foot, without static obstructions, 17% were compliant. And when we included the obstructions, that dropped to 10.6, which is a 39% difference. So now that we've learned about sidewalks and we know that we can use data such as planometric data to derive information, we've learned how to include static obstructions and how to build off of our original data set. Now the question is, how can we come up with a method to actually prioritize our sidewalks when it comes to cities needing to figure out how to tackle this massive problem that many of them have in front of them? An example of what cities are coming across is that they want to find a method to approach this. So Denver, for example, has the neighborhood sidewalk repair program. Now, in this program, they're basically trying to find a way to tackle the whole city and repair their sidewalks. The unfortunate thing is that this is still what we're finding. We're still finding that even after years have passed, this is what the sidewalks still look like throughout the city. So there's still a problem that we're facing throughout Denver. And what happens is, if the sidewalks are in the condition that you just saw, people will find a way. And it's not always a safe way to get where they need to go. So whether they're crossing the roads at the wrong place, they're just walking in the roads in general because the sidewalks just, aren't allowing them to make use of it in a safe manner, it leads to a safety issue as well. So there's more to it than just that. It's more than just the fact that we're seeing deteriorating infrastructure. This is still for the people. So what we're seeing as a result is that cities are coming across lawsuits because of their inability to comply with the ADA. And we're seeing that across the United States. So we see Colorado Springs here, this is Philadelphia. And then we're even seeing it in places like New Orleans. So there was a recent audit that was done on this program that was started in Denver on how they're looking to tackle this problem. And what the report highlights here as you can see in the report highlights, is that at its current pace, they're looking at more than 50 years to complete this. Denver is actually attempting to go out there throughout the entire city, and they're still trying to have people on the ground looking at all of these sidewalks. And they're finding that it's an insurmountable task. 50 years is almost generous, to be honest, for the way that they're looking at this. And not only that, they're not using good data collection methods. So we're not only finding that in Denver, we're finding that is also showing up in the literature as well. We're finding that cities are still trying to take these manual approaches, which is, when you think about cities like Denver, or even larger cities like New York City or Philadelphia, these are large cities, and you can only imagine how long it would take, the manpower, the cost, to try to tackle a problem such as this. So what we did was we approached it from the standpoint of, let's take a look at that geospatial data, and then let's also take a look at trip data that we can take from cell phones as well as from vehicle navigation systems. And we use what's called streetlight data. So to give a little bit of insight to what streetlight data actually looks like, when you go to download the data, okay, you can choose your origin and your destination. And we chose to look at it by traffic analysis zone for all zones throughout the city of Denver. We chose to look at both vehicle and pedestrian trips. And essentially what we did was we looked at all days, 24 hours a day. So we didn't have any limitations on time or day. We looked in the year 2019, since obviously with the pandemic coming about in 2020, that would have kind of thrown off our research a little bit. So we looked at pre-pandemic, and the most recent at the time was 2019. And what we want to know is where are people walking? So we looked at pedestrian trips, and we also want to look at where are short vehicle trips being taken. So essentially, where could people be walking as opposed to driving? So we looked at vehicle trips that were less than or equal to 1 mile. And we looked at it from the standpoint of the origin zone, because if you can't even start your trip, that in itself is already a problem. So our focus was from the origin TAZ. So in addition to looking at the raw data that we got from Streetlight, we also wanted to normalize it by population. Reason being, there are some TAZs that can have a very low population. Let's say there's one person that lives there that walks all the time. Well, from a raw data standpoint, one person in a TAZ compared to another TAZ with 10,000 people, you're not going to have an equal comparison. So we normalized that data by population. And here's a good example of why. So as you can see here, the TAZ that you're seeing, the origin population only had 42 people, okay? So when we took the origin trip volume and we normalized it by the population, what it did was it took it from the raw data value being ranked as 64th in Denver, and it took it to 2nd place in the city of Denver. So that is the reason why they were doing it. So once again, the data that we're using is Planometric Data, and it's provided by the Denver Regional Council of Governments, and they had Sidewalk Polygon data from 2018. And this is an example of what that data looks like throughout the city. So next, we have the data that we need. We have the trip data, we have the counts for pedestrians and for short vehicle trips. And as we have shown, we've gone through how we're able to derive information on pedestrian infrastructure for the entire city, and we use Denver. And now we're going to come up with a data-driven prioritization method. So how can we use this to help cities overcome this overwhelming task? So what we did was we asked a series of questions. First, we want to know which TAZs have the most short vehicle or pedestrian trips. Second, we want to know, is sidewalk infrastructure design an issue in these TAZs? If it's not that, then we ask, well, Maybe it's infrastructure maintenance. Let's take a look and see if maintenance is the issue. If it's not maintenance, then we can kind of come down to the last question that we have here. If that's not the problem, what else could it be? And we'll take a look into that. So to give you an idea of what this looks like from beginning to end, essentially what we do is we take the TAZs, we look at the raw data for the trip origins, as I had mentioned, and then we also normalize it by population, and then we choose the top TAZs to come up with what we want to look at. And this is what it looks like as the results for Denver. So there's 476 TAZs looking at the raw data and then looking at it normalized by population. We ended up with 32 TAZs. So this is what it looks like from a map standpoint to get a better understanding of what these numbers are. So where are these TAZs in the city of Denver? So these are the locations, and you can see we have it broken down by which ones are vehicle and which ones are pedestrian. And it's also broken down by raw data versus normalized population. So next, now that we know which TAZs we want to investigate, let's take a look at the infrastructure design. And this is where our initial research comes into place. And now we can take a look at sidewalk availability, and we can take a look at average width. And we can say which ones are above and below a certain threshold. So of those 32, for sidewalk availability and sidewalk average width, we found that 21 of them, based on a threshold of 80%, fell within this, meaning fell within a sidewalk infrastructure design issue. So the reason why we chose the 80% is basically because we know, number one, that if it was 100%, I mean, that's basically not going to happen because we're looking at data. There are issues that are still going to be inherent in the data. We need to make sure that we're accounting for that. So we chose an 80% threshold issue. 80% threshold to find that issue. And we chose 3 foot as the average width. And of course, we chose sidewalk availability as the 2 metrics. So this is what it looks like, once again, using a map to show the locations of which of our original 32 are falling under this category. So now we still have remaining TAZs that don't have sidewalk infrastructure design as an issue. So next, we want to take a look and see if maintenance might be the issue. So what we did was we did a field assessment with this, and we took a look at the sidewalk quality, the crossing quality, ramp quality, and ramp availability. And then we want to see how many of those fall into infrastructure maintenance as an issue. So what we found was there were 8 in total that fell under one of these categories. So let's take a look a little bit closer at how we did this. So we used the ADA standards for accessible design. We used this document to be able to go out in the field and take these measurements. And we did it with the use of ArcGIS Collector, which is now being phased out and being Field Maps is being used. But we were able to use this to assist us while we were in the field. It doesn't have to be used, but we made use of it so that it could assist us while we were out there in the field. And here's a map of those locations of where we found issues. And you can see the breakdown of whether it was sidewalk, crossing, or ramp as an issue. So to give you a better idea of what this actually looks like, it's one thing to talk about it, but it's another thing to have a visual description so you have a better understanding of what this actually looks like. So this would be on the left, a condition issue. In the middle, you can see the elevation right there. That should be flagstone. That would not pass what the ADA standards are. And as you can see, cross slope on the sidewalk. Next, we also looked at crossings. So you have private driveways, commercial driveways, and alleys, and you can see examples there of slope condition and elevation issues. And then lastly, we also looked at the ramps. So we wanted to see, once again, does it comply with ADA standards? On the left, there's no landing. In the center, the running slope. And on the right, there is no ramp. So now we still have a handful that are left. We found issues for all but a handful. So let's take a look again by doing another field assessment and trying to figure out what else the issue might be. So there were only 3 TAZs remaining. And apparently what we found was for 2 of them, major roads border them, which might be the issue. And then there was 1 where we could not find any apparent issues with it. So as you can see here for 30 and 32, as you see on the map, they are bordered by major roads. And this is an example of what it looks like. So this is not an optimal scenario for any pedestrian. I mean, these are wide crossings. You're going to see high volumes of traffic. This is not really someplace that many people are going to want to be. And then on top of it, we even found here, there are sections where if you tried to walk down one side of it, it goes to nowhere. So in the end, what are we finding? What we're finding is that it's great that this data is available. We really can start making headway on these problems that we're finding. And we can help fill these gaps, these voids that we're finding in planning, as well as in the academic literature. But we're still finding that there's issues. There's still a lot of work that needs to be done with what we found. So for example, here, this is what sidewalk data would look like for one city. But in reality, it's disconnected because they're not including things such as driveways. So there's still minor points that need to be attended to. A big one is a lot of data either had no metadata whatsoever, so it tells you nothing about the data set, or it was scant. You're given maybe a generic description, which doesn't tell you much about what's being given to you and what you're trying to analyze. And the reality is that we still need to figure out how to bring in the static obstructions, because that's a really big component, as we learned in our research. But that type of data is definitely not as prevalent. And that's something that is very important to our understanding of our pedestrian infrastructure. So it's wonderful. We have all these advances in data, all these advances in geospatial and big data. We have planometric data, but we got to remember that this is for people. Data is fantastic. It's great that we have access to this and we can learn a lot. But we got to remember that the whole point of this is for people. We want to be able to gather and meet. We want to be able to have our kids go to school safely. We want to be able to enjoy where we're at. And we want to be able to do it safely, and we want to be able to do it wherever we want in cities. It should be an option for us to be able to walk. So with that, I want to say thank you again. I really appreciate this opportunity to be able to conduct the research, work with Dr. Marshall, and I really appreciate the funding for this project with this grant. And with that, thank you very much.
Thank you, Nicholas.
You're welcome.
We have a couple of questions for either of you. Let me read those. How is the static obstruction data gathered?
So the static obstruction data, what we did was we looked through the City of Cambridge's website, their geospatial data portal. And we wanted to see of their transportation related data, what fell within the sidewalks essentially. So it's a pretty simple initial analysis of taking a look and seeing what they have and what falls within sidewalks. Then Dr. Marshall and I talked and we said, okay, well, we have these infrastructure components. How can we take that data now and incorporate it into the sidewalk data set? And what we did was we did research on each of those to figure out how can we best represent it as a polygon so that we can understand what space it's taking up within the sidewalk. And then that's essentially what we did. To keep it pretty general, I don't know if there's anything you want to add, Dr. Marshall. I don't want to get too into the weeds on
In
it.
case the question is asking more about how Cambridge collected that data, I think it depends on sort of which data set. Like some was probably collected via the planometric data and the aerial. Other might have been done as part of an asset management project where somebody's walking around and sort of marking where every hydrant might be or something like that.
That's okay. That makes sense. Yeah, the majority of it, correct. Yeah, it was their planometric data set. So.
Okay, another question. Did you look at reciprocal TAZs where lots of people were walking? How did those areas compare to the bad TAZs?
TAZ.
So I think the question is about the ones where people are going to. I guess we're focused sort of on the origin.
Do you?
Yeah, I was gonna say.
I can open this up and let Laura clarify that question if you'd like. Okay, Laura can speak now.
Okay. Yes?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Great. Yeah, so you were talking about maintenance issues and obstruction issues in sidewalks where people were not walking, but taking a lot of like short trips, right? Trips that could be replaced by walking. And you also talked about how one of the TAZs had a very high percentage of people walking. And so I was wondering if you looked at all at the origin TAZs that had a lot of people walking, and what are those areas doing well that the areas that have a lot less people walking are doing poorly? Does that make sense? Like, I imagine obstruction issues exist in areas where people have a high percentage of walkers as well, but maybe just not to the same extent.
So it's tricky because Denver did not have enough obstruction data to really do a good analysis on that, but that is where we did the analysis on the prioritization. So we didn't look at road choice as much in Cambridge, but you're right. I mean, looking at people's behaviors in terms of those obstructions would be a great follow-up study to this.
Okay, there's not any other questions at the moment. We might give it a few more minutes just in case someone else has a question.
I see Laura's comment on the chat too. You talk about 100% availability doesn't account for access, egress. And yeah, that's totally true in terms of the planometric data. Like we can't get everything with it, but I think what we're finding is it's still a huge step forward in the research. But we're going to have to keep moving forward. It's going to be bringing in the obstruction data, and then maybe start bringing in things like LiDAR to collect even better data than we can even come close to getting with the planometric data. So it's research and we're moving forward. So I think it's much better than I think we've had historically, for sure.
Sure, if I may.
Yes.
All right, so first of all, thank you, two doctors, actually, Nicholas and Dr. Marshall, for this very timely research. And I think it's really timely because it really helps the social equity issue. I mean, if we think about who's hurting most, I mean, really underserved communities and disadvantaged population. So in that context, I'm just thinking beyond this research. I mean, if we have to think about climate change adaptation, in that scenario, maybe there's even more problematic scenarios, I guess, down the road with the sidewalks. I'm just curious whether you had thoughts or maybe planning to explore some of those.
The equity and equality issue is really interesting, and that's actually one we have been working on and just wrote a paper about. I think also what we're finding is you don't often see the trends you might expect, and part of the reason why is like oftentimes we put what seems like a good sidewalk next to such a terrible road in some of the lower income and minority neighborhoods. So our sidewalk data doesn't really give us a sense of whether that's a safe environment for pedestrians, or we're not able to account for things like the crossings, which Laura mentioned in her comment too. But at the other end, like, yes, there is there are some issues. Because the other end of the spectrum, you'd have sort of a really wealthy neighborhood that doesn't even need a sidewalk because the street is so slow and you feel safe walking even without one. So it's sort of tricky to account for those distinctions. Nick, do you want to mention anything about that paper?
I don't know if I'd mention anything about that paper in particular. I think it's important to note, though, the fact that even when you and I had first discussed digging into this research topic way back in the beginning, I think we were hoping to be able to dig into some of these questions earlier, only to realize just how poor the sidewalk data is in terms of availability, what it looked like. We ended up having to tackle more in the beginning just to get started than we had realized we were going to be getting into. So I completely agree. I'm very excited to hopefully be able to keep moving forward with it and with our research on that kind of stuff. But I think it's really important to note, just from a foundational standpoint of the sidewalk data and pedestrian infrastructure as a whole, crossings, curb ramps, all of that, it's poor. There's no organization to it. It's really all over the place across the United States. And I think that in and of itself is something that I just want to make sure that I'm pointing out. But we really are excited to be able to continue with the research and look into things like equity and equality, and we are starting to do that. But the unfortunate thing was we had a lot of work to do just to even get started. So
Right.
that's
why this one is so timely. I was wondering, I was thinking about the Build Back Better agenda in terms of, okay, now if we have the money to build more sidewalks or design better sidewalks, can we implement some of the greener infrastructure technologies like permeable pavement or whatever it is? I mean, for carbon sequestration or for stormwater management or for, I don't know, like maybe cooler pavement or, I mean, something along those lines. Yeah, it seems like if, say, all of a sudden the federal government is giving the cities a lot of money to improve their sidewalks, maybe it could be built back, but also build back better.
You're totally right. There is so much room for improvement on this, because I don't think there's really been, I think we've been going the wrong direction, because I do walk around neighborhoods, from 50, 60 years ago, when the contractor would stamp their name and year in the sidewalk, and 60 years later, that sidewalk is still in good shape. And then the newer sidewalks are crumbling. So we've actually, I feel like, been going in the wrong direction in terms of even giving the concrete time to cure properly before we start using it. And then you look at what some other countries are doing, I think maybe more on the bike lane side, but they're putting these like little things that glow in the dark sort of in the pavement. We could do the same sort of thing here and have the sidewalks glow at night and not need to rely on sort of overhead lighting and things like that. So there is, yeah, you're right. There's so much room for improvement on that aspect. And if, I'm curious to see how it can go.
Yeah, actually, my very last comment, since there are some other questions in the chat box, one other comment is really, you mentioned, this kind of sidewalk assets have been kind of ignored in the past, and it's not well inventoried and everything. So, so certainly the research needs, related to this kind of assets or better preservation or better accountability. I think that's an interesting one. Maybe there needs to be some sort of national dialogue and some sort of roadmap developed, and so that we can divide and conquer. I mean, not a single group can really handle this, but it seems like it's a timely action item, in my opinion.
It is. And I think a lot of cities feel a need, and they're sort of doing it on their own and just piecemeal. Like, it would be nice if there was a little bit of organization so they all start collecting the same data. Because I mean, Nick ran into this problem time and time again. Like, the data sets we were getting were apples and oranges. So we have to jump through all these hoops just to put them in the same sort of format where they were comparable and we could sort of look at the issues we wanted to. So some national level guidance or even state level guidance, I think would go a long way towards making things easier to work with for researchers and people that are trying to improve sidewalks.
In some ways, that was the unfortunate thing, that we we would have been able to include more cities in some of these, some of the research we were doing. But as Dr. Marshall was just saying, the data sets were like apples and oranges, and you couldn't always get them to line up. And that's where I think it was most surprising, just to realize how completely different, just because a city may have sidewalk data set or sidewalks within another data set, such as impervious surface, trying to get these to line up was difficult, just because it's all over the place. And yes, a standard of some sort would be, and it sounds so basic and fundamental, but it seems like such an important thing, because you can't even use a lot of these data sets together to try to approach and tackle the problem and understand how to do it the same way as somebody else. So yeah, just building off of what Dr. Marshall said, agreed.